But let me say this again, if it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks or international conventions are still frustrating plans at that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships.
Well, let's give that statement some context. In a good day for humanity and a bad day for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the UK's highest court has today unanimously ruled the government's Rwanda policy is unlawful. Now a number of Conservative MPs are predictably howling for the UK to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
As I said, and I'll repeat, if it becomes clear that our domestic legal frameworks, or indeed international conventions, are still frustrating plans after that point, I am prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships because we are absolutely committed to stopping the votes.
The Prime Minister seemingly suggesting it may be a terrific idea to pass emergency legislation to disapply human rights laws. What kind of message would that send to the rest of the world? Now listen to Conservative MP Simon Clarke attempting to justify the position.
Delighted now to bring in Simon Clarke MP. Of course, he's an ex-cabinet minister, and he's among those that have been calling for the UK to leave the ECHR. Simon, thanks so much for joining us. I'll put it straight to you. Do you think that should happen? And do you think it will solve all problems as it relates to this Rwanda policy?
Well, today is a really serious challenge to who governs Britain and whether Parliament can deliver when we say we want to address what is clearly, by anyone's standards, an unsustainable level of illegal immigration. And for my part, I think that the gauntlet is now being thrown down, and I think we are going to have to pass emergency legislation at a minimum to set out that the will of Parliament will apply, notwithstanding the ECHR and the associated conventions that the Justices referenced. But we may also need to consider, if that is not legally viable, withdrawal from the ECHR, because let us be clear, replacing it with the British Bill of Rights does not mean that human rights don't apply in Britain anymore.
Well, let's just sit on a shelf for a moment that the government's policy also breached the Refugee Convention, as well as other international conventions, so leaving the ECHR won't change the judgment. Let's unpick what was said in that interview.
And I think we are going to have to pass emergency legislation at a minimum to set out that the will of Parliament will apply, notwithstanding the ECHR and the associated conventions that the Justices referenced.
Well, again, what kind of message would passing legislation that enables the government to disapply human rights law send to the rest of the world?
But we may also need to consider, if that is not legally viable, withdrawal from the ECHR.
Well, again, let's just sit on a shelf that the government's policy also breached the Refugee Convention and other international conventions, so leaving the ECHR won't change the outcome of the judgment. Suggesting we join countries like Russia and Belarus by pulling out of the ECHR is completely insane. Remember, the European Convention on Human Rights protects our right to a fair trial, freedom of assembly and expression, the right to participate in free elections, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination, the right to privacy, freedom from torture and degrading treatment.
Because let us be clear, replacing it with the British Bill of Rights does not mean that human rights don't apply in Britain anymore.
But of course, replacing the ECHR with our own Bill of Rights presupposes we can actually trust the government doing it with our human rights in the first place. How can we trust this government with our human rights when it's already trying to curtail our human rights under the existing convention we're already a part of?
We clearly have a problem with human rights law in this country that is making it difficult for us to achieve our objectives.
According to International Human Rights Watch, the UK could soon make the list of countries that abuse rather than protect human rights, thanks to this government's outright onslaught on the rights of its own citizens. Just think about that. During the past 12 months, we've had an Anti-Strike Act designed to rob millions of workers of their democratic right to strike. An Elections Act will lock millions of people out of the electoral process. A blatant act of voter suppression by the government. And new laws will strip back our right to protest and limit our rights to judicial review. an affront to the very principles of fairness and government accountability. So the simple fact is, based on its own actions, this government cannot be trusted to protect our human rights. Which brings us back to the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament earlier today.